It's so fascinating to watch and to be on the front lines of observing this movement, because I remember initially, so yeah, 2 weeks after the story broke, I began my job. And we were basically all glued to our phones, refreshing our Twitter feeds, trying to find out who the next to fall would be. And it really was this tsunami, this domino effect, one after the next after the next. And then it felt like there was a little bit of a lull. And being a skeptical journalist who has written about women and gender issues for a long time, I, of course, was sort of looking at my clock, at my watch, wondering, when are people going to have fatigue? When is the fatigue going to set in? Are people going to get tired of this storyline? And they have not. It's been incredibly encouraging. And what I think we're seeing is a shift from initially these very high-profile cases with very well-off, privileged women who, in many cases, were more famous than their accusers. Like Harvey Weinstein is a huge name, but globally, he's not as big a name as his victims were. And I think we've seen that expand into looking more critically at working class industries, into looking at the role of race in this conversation. And I think now really gearing towards looking at solutions, because the reality is this is going to keep happening, but how do institutions respond? And if the legal system has not really been able to keep up, then what changes are happening and what mechanisms are in place to prevent this from happening in the future? So I think to some extent the conversation has been shifting to solutions from simply the problem. Though, of course, if today's news, last night's breaking news about the Attorney General in New York is any indication, the news will not stop.
Jessica's editor called me like 2 hours ago and said she can't come. And I said, she's coming. She'll be right back to write the story.
Yeah.
So what you've just described is, we're
so
all
if anyone
glad
has
you're
any
here.
ideas, like, let me know.
You've just described something that's been fundamentally kind of evolutionary. I mean, first a revolution, and then like the story keeps evolving. But what are the other stories that you would put under the header of gender or women in work that aren't being told yet?
I mean, one thing that I'm very interested in this moment is masculinity. And we seem to be talking about this equation and all of these problems, and so much of this is insidious and reflective of a culture that is still patriarchal in nature. But even at the Times, you know, we're looking at a lot of this through a women's perspective and a female lens, which is important because traditionally we have not done that. But there are huge things changing in the world today, and what does that mean for men? And how does the way we teach masculinity play into this? And when we think about things like consent, to what role does gender play into that? You know, what are we teaching young boys about what it means to be a man and what affirmative consent looks like? So I'm really interested in covering the male aspect of this as well as the female aspect of this, and truly you can't separate these things. Like, this is intersectional in its approach, and you have to think about all of these things as a whole. You saw at the end of the video, it said, gender is a lens through which we view the world, so that doesn't necessarily mean that every story we're focusing on is specific to gender. It means that that is part of the way that we see stories at large.